Okay, colleagues, let's make a start again. So welcome back after coffee, and great to see you again, and really pleased to hear how good a time that you've been having over the last few days. So it's my pleasure now to really introduce our keynote speaker. Absolutely delighted to have Lord John Alderdice with us here today. Now, I've got a very long bio, and I'm not going to cover all of it, because it'll take up actually most of the session, but John is incredibly distinguished. So this year, John will be celebrating 30 years as a Liberal Democrat life member of the House of Lords. So it is 30-year anniversaries at the moment. It's Harris Manchester's 30-year anniversary as well. And as I mentioned a couple of days ago, our department 30-year anniversary will be coming up very soon as well. So John really trained at Queen's University Belfast, and trained as a psychoanalytic psychiatrist. Belfast has got a very dear place to me. My daughter's currently there as a resident doctor. Thankfully, she's not striking. That's an English phenomena, but thoroughly enjoying that. So trained there, and has had a number of academic positions based in at the University of Belfast, University of Maryland. Has got strong links with a number of colleges in the Oxford and Cambridge region, and particularly pleased that, John, you're a senior research fellow here at Harris Manchester, so welcome back home, really, in effect. John's had numerous honorary degrees and professorships. He's been honoured with a number of awards. And particularly relevant, I think, is he's played a really important role in negotiating the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, and subsequently became Speaker of the new Assembly. So, I mean, a very skilled and distinguished portfolio of achievements, and really very pleased that John will be speaking to us today on the incredibly important subject of hope. And boy, do we need that at the moment. So very grateful for everybody in the room and those joining us online. And the plan is that John will speak, and then we'll have a bit of a conversation. There will be plenty of time for discussion. So John, thanks so much for doing this, and a very warm welcome back to Harris Manchester. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Aziz, and it's always an enormous pleasure to be with medical colleagues and to be back here at Harris Manchester College. I don't get here as often as I would like to because of other commitments, but to get both a chance to be with medical colleagues and here at Harris Manchester College, it's a double win from my point of view, and an opportunity to engage with you. I'll speak for a little while, Aziz and I will have a conversation, and then we'll have a conversation more widely, and that's usually the place which is much the most interesting bit, because you start to ask questions about the things that you're interested in rather than the things that I'm interested in. It's a difficult time. This is a really very difficult time. We were just talking earlier on there about moving away from the United States, because the academic life in the United States is really very difficult, and I've just come up from Westminster, where we have just signed off a report in the Select Committee on International Relations and Defence on UK-US relations. We should have signed it off in the later part of last year. But every week when we came back to look at the report, we had to say, okay, scrub that, we've got to change that, oh, we've got to put that in, oh, there's new information has come in. Eventually we just decided, look, things are as they are. Just let's get this report out, and it'll be published next week, and you'll probably see in the FT and so on some accounts of it. It's not a very pretty picture in terms of relationships between the UK and the US, which was a historic relationship. It was a very positive and constructive one. It was an important one, particularly after the Second World War, but even subsequently. So these are very difficult times. Now, one of the reasons I was asked to come along and talk about hope, Shona said to me, she was very much aware that colleagues coming along to these meetings, coming from different parts of the world, were, of course, involved in their academic work and their professional lives. But like everybody else, they were affected by the fact that in their own countries or neighbouring countries or in the wider context, some very worrying things were happening. And maybe it's important to think about that. Then, of course, I completely agree. I mean, doctors have to be prepared to deal with difficult situations. I mean, very few people come along to see us as doctors because everything's absolutely fine. That's particularly true of psychiatrists. You know, people don't usually come along to say, I've no problems at all, because the next question would be, first of all, why do you not have any problems? And secondly, why are you coming along to see me in that case? So we're used to dealing with difficult circumstances in individual people's lives. That's what we do. But there's a wider sense in which things are not good at present. And whenever I was growing up and coming into my early teens in Northern Ireland, that's the kind of time when you begin to become conscious of the wider world, the community, what's going on. And just at that time, everything was breaking down again into violence, as it had repeatedly over some hundreds of years. And I knew some people from different parts of the community, and I thought, this is very puzzling. When I talk to these people, when we sit down together, we have a perfectly pleasant conversation, we can get on together, we can go and do stuff. I need to try to understand, why is it that we get involved in these intractable, violent political conflicts? So, as you might expect, for a young person at that time, you say, well, I'll read up about some politics, some political science, try to understand what's going on in the community. And so I started to do that. And after a while, I thought to myself, this is rubbish, really, because all of it was based on the notion that people were rational actors, that they were operating in their best socioeconomic and power interests. And it was perfectly clear that what was going on was not in anybody's interests. Everybody was suffering. Everybody was being damaged by it. I thought, I really need to try to understand this, because I guess I come from a background where when there's a problem, what you want to do is to understand it so that you can do something constructive about it. Because the danger is, if you just do stuff without understanding it, you can sometimes make the situation worse. And we all know that as doctors. So I thought, well, who should I engage with on this? I thought, well, there's a bunch of people who spend their time trying to understand why people behave in a non-rational, destructive, and often self-destructive way. That's psychiatrists. That's what they do. So I went into medicine and psychiatry and into psychoanalysis to try to see if I could understand why individual people got involved in these destructive relationships. Maybe I could then begin to understand why a whole community of people, the community that I was growing up in, was getting involved in all of this self-destructive behavior. And as time went on, it became apparent to me that there were some things that perhaps we could do. And I started to get involved in politics and stood for office and was elected. I discovered after a little while that unless you're the leader of the party, you don't actually get to decide what the party's going to do and say. So I made it my business to become the leader of the party. And what I'd done in making the decision about which party to get involved in, I'd written to the various political parties. And I'd asked them for their material. And there were basically 5 main political parties. So there were 2 on the Protestant, Unionist, pro-British side, 1 relatively moderate and 1 more extreme. On the Catholic nationalist side, pro-Ireland side, there were also 2 political parties, but one of them moderate, very thoughtful, and the other was involved with the IRA. It was the political wing of the IRA. And that was the only one of the 5 parties I didn't actually write to, because I thought, I know perfectly well that I'm not going to get involved with that party. But there was one other party called the Alliance Party, and its name basically says what it was. It was people from both sides of the community who said, look, we don't want this violence and trouble. We want a better life for everybody. That's our agenda. And I thought, well, that's my agenda. And also I thought, if I join the party, it's a context from which I can work therapeutically. I can engage with people from different sides of the community and get involved. Now, I had a slight anxiety about medical colleagues, and particularly my colleagues in psychiatry, because I thought, well, they'll think to themselves, well, why doesn't he just get on with doing the medicine? And particularly in psychoanalysis, I thought the psychoanalytic colleagues said, well, you know, he's just running away from the therapeutic work, and it's all an escape, and so on and so on. I didn't find any of that at all. I found that medical colleagues, psychiatric colleagues, psychoanalytic colleagues said, we're really glad that one of our people is being prepared to get involved in this. We don't know what to do. We wouldn't even feel comfortable about getting involved if we did know what to do. But we're really glad that you're getting involved, and we want to try to be supportive of you. And in a way, that's the first thing that I would say to all of you. You will from time to time perhaps be a little bit anxious about what some professional colleagues think of the research work that you're doing, or the clinical work you're doing, or other aspects of how you choose to follow your professional life. But if you look around and if you listen and if you engage and have conversations with colleagues, you will find that there are those who say the same thing that they said to me. Actually, it's great that you're doing that. And they will be supportive, and you will often need to turn to folk like that who will be supportive, because life's not straightforward. Professional life is not easy, and in different countries it's sometimes very difficult. But those kinds of network of relationships and connections is very often what keeps you going during the difficult times. So anyway, we got involved and began to engage, taking some of the principles of the therapeutic life and applying them. So one of the things was, well, if there's a patient, first of all, you have to meet with them. You try to encourage them to talk about what they want, what's interesting to them, what's a problem to them, what's a challenge for them. You want them to draw it. Now, that's a very different approach to politics than is usual. Because as you know, usually as a politician, you come along to tell other people that you've got the answer, and this is what it is, and they need to listen to you. So when I started as a young political leader, I was elected when I was 32, and I started going around and meeting, at that time Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister, Charles Haughey was the Taoiseach, the Prime Minister of Ireland. There were various other political leaders, all of whom were of a different generation, shall we say. They were a lot older than me. And they found it curious that there was this young guy who was a psychiatrist, of all things. Some of them thought psychiatry, by the way, was not a bad training for Northern Ireland politics, and they were more right about that than they knew, actually. But what was possible when I met with them was to try to draw them out to talk about their concerns, their interests, what they hoped for, what they feared, because all of the groups, all of the parties, both of the governments had huge anxieties. And of course, in psychiatry, you spend a lot of your time drawing people out to talk about their anxieties, not because talking about them solves the problem, but it's a step in the right direction. And so I met with all of these folk. And of course, the second thing you know is not just do you need to engage and meet, but if you've got, say, a problem family that you're dealing with, you want to try to draw them into a place where they can engage with each other, where you can look at the family system, not just the individual internal self, but the family system. And so you try to draw them together. So the next thing to do was see, was it possible to work towards inter-party talks, where the different parties would get together, hoping that they might be prepared to listen to each other and to listen to the problems that each of them had. And I was very fortunate, because at the time we were doing this, global leaders, people like Mandela, de Klerk, Clinton, Gorbachev, these people regarded themselves as leaders because they were concerned to resolve conflicts. One of the difficulties now, as I try to work in these kinds of ways, is many global leaders see themselves as leaders because they want to conduct conflicts, not to resolve them. So it's a different kind of dispensation, and it means you've got to approach it in a different way. But at that time, there was a genuine interest to try to find a resolution. And in fact, at that time, the Oslo process in the Middle East was going very well. And the situation in South Africa was also moving to a better place. And people would stop you in the street and say, John, if they can do something in South Africa, if they can do something in the Middle East, for goodness sake, we've got to be able to do something here in Northern Ireland. And it began to become possible to get some people together, not those who were involved directly with violence, whether they were Sinn Féin and the IRA, or whether they were loyalist paramilitaries who didn't have much of a political representation, but they had other things that made their presence felt. And the other parties, we were able to find a way of getting folk together to reach some kind of agreement. Now, I could talk a lot about all of this, but I want to draw out the thing that was really important for me, was that we began to discover that the ways of addressing the conflict that seemed completely rational and reasonable just didn't work. So, for example, people would say, well, you get together the people from both sides, the reasonable people, not the people involved in the violence. People involved in the violence, they're not going to be prepared to listen to anybody. So let's get the more reasonable people involved. We'll engage together, we'll get an agreement with the two governments, and that will marginalize the extremists, and we'll be able to settle it down. Perfectly reasonable. Only problem was, it doesn't work. It doesn't work because someone on the extremes can always literally blow it to pieces. They can shoot a bunch of people, they can blow a number of people up, and suddenly everybody's back into their trenches again. And one of the leaders, John Hume, who later went on to get the Nobel Peace Prize, who was the leader of the Nationalist Party, I remember very well, whenever there was a difficulty, he and I and the two unionist leaders would get together without any assistance, without the British Irish and governments and so on, and just sit together and say, look, we've got a problem. How do we take the next step here? And I remember we were sitting together in Stormont, and John said, look, we're not getting anywhere here. I need to go and talk to the Republicans, in other words, to the IRA. And I looked around at the unionist leader, Jim Molyneux, and the blood just drained from his face. You know how they describe in the textbooks what it's like when an aortic aneurysm bursts, you know? If I hadn't known the conversation, I would have thought his aortic aneurysm had burst, because just blood drained from his face. And he said, well, that's it then. He said in an angry way. He just, that's it, there's no hope. And what he meant was, if you go talk to them, we can't continue talking to you. And furthermore, there's nothing you could possibly agree with them about that we could go along with at all. So it's hopeless. And I must admit, my initial response was similar. And I went home that night, and I really didn't sleep very well at all, because I thought, this is really very difficult and serious. What are we going to do? Now, I knew John well enough to know that once he had decided something, he had to test it to destruction. He wasn't going to be persuadable by me or by anybody else, even by his own party. That was the kind of person he was. And so I came to the view that I would have to persuade my own people that we would have to test this idea to destruction. And we went down that road. It was long and complicated and so on. But there were a few things that came from it. The first thing was, if this was not about political science and the problems that were usually adduced to be the difficulty, well, it's all about policing, it's all about the administration of justice, it's a human rights question, it's socioeconomic disadvantage. If it wasn't those things, what was at the back of all of that? And we came to the view that the problem was disturbed historic relationships between communities of people. All of these other things, the human rights problems, the socioeconomic difficulties, the policing problems, the administration of justice, all of these other things were symptoms of a more fundamental problem of relationships which were not just disturbed, they were historic relationships. They'd gone back. You know, whenever people fall out with each other and have a disagreement, it may go on for decades. But when communities fall out, it can go on for hundreds of years. And this is what had been happening. Time after time, people would try to bring things together and it would go to pieces again. And we thought, okay, let's think about what the disturbed relationships are. Because people from outside would come and say, well, it's obviously the two sides. So we've got to get the Unionists and Nationalists together. But we began to say, wait a minute. Yes, that's true. And those aren't the only relationships. It's a little bit like whenever you're working with a person, maybe you're working with a patient, and you decide, I think we need to bring the family in here. Every time I do something, and I seem to be making some progress, it all dissolves before the next session because they go back to the family and all sorts of things happen there. So what were the rest of the relationship? Well, the relationship between North and South in Ireland. That was another important relationship. The relationship between Britain and Ireland, a historic disturbed relationship. And of course there were relationships with Europe and the United States, but the three key relationships were the one within Northern Ireland, between North and South, and between Britain and Ireland. So when we started to put together a process, those who represented those relationships were the ones that needed to be present. So if we were going to deal with the Northern Ireland situation and get those parties together, that was the parties within Northern Ireland and the British government, because it was the sovereign government. But if we were going to deal with relations between North and South, we had to bring in the Irish government. And if it was between Britain and Ireland, then those were the two governments, not the Northern Ireland parties at all. And gradually this got pieced together, and two or three things emerged from it for me. Some of it by listening around the table, some of it simply by engaging with people from a different political background and perspective. And then taking those ideas to other places confirmed that this was not just an Irish question. The first thing that we found with each of the parties, and I found it in every part of the world that I've gone to where there's been serious, ongoing, intractable political violence, is one or more community that feels humiliated and disrespected. And you know, it's the most toxic thing in human experience. We can have an argument, we can have a discussion, we can have a debate and so on, but if I say something to humiliate you in front of the rest of the colleagues here, you will never forget it, and you will find it very difficult to ever forgive it either. And if you ever were to bump into me, I was going to say 30 or 40 years' time, that's pretty unlikely given the colour of my beard, but anyway, if you were to bump into me at some point in the future, you would have a bad feeling. You wouldn't even necessarily remember exactly why you had that bad feeling, but you would have this really bad feeling because it's a very toxic thing. And when that happens in communities, when humiliation and disrespect happens to communities of people, it's incredibly toxic. And unfortunately, very often in these intractably violent political situations, you find it's not just one side that feels that. Very often, both sides feel humiliated and disrespected. The second thing that we found was in all of those situations, and I've tried it in lots of other places around the world, there's always at least one group of people that feels they've been treated deeply unfairly. This is not to do with the law. That's why I don't use the word treated unjustly. It's unfairly. Joan and I have two sons who are now grown up and they have their own kids and so on, as indeed we have a daughter who's also grown up and has her own kids. But when the boys were much younger, you know, one of them would come along to me and he would say, "It's not fair, Daddy, it's not fair." I said, "Okay, what is it that's not fair?" And he would say, "Well, you know, Stephen had taken his car, or Peter had taken his ball, or whatever it was." But it wasn't something that came from up here. It's something that came from in here. It's a very powerful feeling about things, much more than a piece of cognition. And actually, it's how we feel about things that has much more impact on how we behave than what we think about things. It's not that what we think about things isn't important. Of course it is important. But you can think all sorts of things and not want to act on them. You know, if I was to say to you, "Well, how many of you would like to go to heaven?" Well, some of you might say, "Well, I don't actually believe in it." I say, "Well," others would say, "Yes." I say, "Okay, would you like to go this afternoon?" "Well, I'm not in any rush." And to be honest, it's a bit like that with the United Ireland for the Irish government. If you say to them, "Do you want United Ireland?" They say, "Yes." I said, "Would you like to have it tomorrow?" I said, "Well, I'm not so sure about that." I remember during the talks process, one of the senior Irish negotiators came to me, and we'd been having a really difficult time with some of the unionists. And he said, "John, I've just been thinking, you know, if we had a United Ireland, a boy like Willie McRae there might be the Minister of Agriculture or something like that." I said, "That's right, Sean. I'm going off the notion," he says. The reality of having to engage with those with whom you deeply disagree is much more difficult than the theory. So there were always those two things, this sense of humiliation and disrespect, this feeling of having been treated unfairly. And the third thing, in almost all of these situations, people had actually tried democratic political structures that simply hadn't worked out. Because often people, particularly people from a liberal background like myself, think that if you get the right structure, if you get the right constitution, the right model of elections, that will solve the problem. But it doesn't. It's like saying, if you put two people together and get them to sign a marriage contract, that will give them a long-term relationship. No, it's the other way around. You develop the relationship, you work on the relationship, and then you may well want to make some kind of commitment. But the commitment comes out of the relationship. It's not something that comes before the relationship. And it's true in political life as well. You have to find some kind of way in which you engage with people to address the problems that I've described. Now, as we explored this further, and I began to get involved in other situations where there was conflict. So, for example, after 9/11, I was asked to come and meet with the World Federation of Scientists, who were meeting at CERN in Switzerland. And 2 or 3 of them had come actually from different parts of the world. One was from Pakistan, one was from America, one was from France. And they said, John, we need you to come and help us. I said, what's the problem? He said, well, you know about 9/11? I said, yes. He said, well, the Western scientists want to use their science to get rid of these people that are doing nasty things. And the Eastern scientists say, no, you've got to understand why they're doing these things. And it's now come to a point where we're about to split because we can't agree on how to approach these things. So I started to meet with them and get them to talk about these difficulties, and we found a way of resolving the problem amongst themselves. But what it led me into was quite a number of years of meeting with senior scientists, many of them working in fundamental physics. And that began to help me realize that many of the things that I'd been thinking about at the level of human beings and at the level of communities were actually also there right down at the level of fundamental physics. So, for example, when I was saying it was about relationships at an individual level, and it's about relationships at a communal level, it's also about relationships at every other conceivable level. And you know, at that stage, I still thought that the fundamental thing were particles, and that would be the relationship between the particles. And then it's go, well, actually, no, it's actually force fields, and it's the relationship between them. And suddenly I began to realize this whole question of how entities or fields or whatever relate with each other is fundamental to every level of existence. And when we find ourselves dealing with problems, we have to be aware of those kinds of things. Now, this was quite a challenge when you started to try to work out not so much what to do, but how to think about it. For a while I thought, well, what we're dealing with here is a hierarchical series of systems built on top of each other. But the difficulty about that was it didn't operate as a hierarchy in the sense that it wasn't all one way. Things from below could influence things from above could influence things from below. And I gradually began to realize we had to find another way of thinking about these things. But I was also thinking about that for another reason. I'd been getting quite down in the early 2000s because although things were going perfectly well in Northern Ireland, when I say perfectly well, relationships never go perfectly well. They're always up and down. But nobody was going back to war, and nobody had any thoughts about going back to war. But the wider world wasn't looking like that. In fact, I came to the conclusion back 2015 that we were heading into another global conflict. And this was going to be much worse than any previous global conflict, because we now had the capacity to destroy all civilization. That had never happened in a global conflict before. We had that. We had environmental challenges, which were much worse than anything that had been there before. Technology was developing, and every month it was developing more and more quickly. And already, even then, people were talking about the likelihood of pandemics. Technology itself was producing great ways forward, but also considerable challenges. And around about 2017, I was really getting quite down because I could see we were moving in a bad direction. And by the way, we still are. But in 2017, I began to realize that we were at a 500th anniversary. 500 years before, in 1517, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg, Germany, and was one of the triggers to the Protestant Reformation. In other words, at various times in history, for reasons there's been a really dramatic shift and change in the way people understand things. And I tried to think, well, what was happening then? Well, there was technological development. Gutenberg had invented the printing press. That made a dramatic change. There was a huge disenchantment with the leaderships, religious, political. There was also a sense that these leaders didn't actually understand what was happening in science and technology. They were pulling against it. They weren't taking on the ideas of Copernicus and Galileo and Newton and so on. I thought, well, actually, this is the same kind of thing that's happening now. We have this development of technology, which is Gutenberg ++++ with the internet. We have this sense amongst people that they don't trust their leaders, that they're dishonest, that they don't have their interests at heart, and that they don't really understand what's happening in science and technology and what to do about it. But at the time, we found a way of addressing it. And one of the reasons was because people then had a clear idea of what the alternative was. They said, what we want to do is try to ensure not that we are run by bishops and princes and people like that, but that people, ordinary people, have the chance to speak about what they think. And of course, because of Gutenberg, people could access literature. They could read about it. They could argue about it. And I thought, well, is that a possibility? Can we do something similar now? I thought, well, there's one important difference. At that time, they were clear what the alternative was. They were clear that the alternative was a move towards what we now call democracy. And we spent the next 300 or 400 years implementing it. First of all, it was men with a bit of money and land. Then it was men with more money and land. Eventually, it was women and people with disabilities, and so on and so on and so on. And we came to the end of all of that. It didn't really solve the problem. In fact, we had the worst war in history at the beginning of the last century, 1914 to 1918. Massive numbers of people destroyed. And so scientists got together after that. Intellectuals got together. Famously, for example, there was a correspondence between Freud and Einstein. You know, why do we have war? What are we going to do about it? Einstein said, we've got to have a different way of thinking about these things. But despite that, despite the League of Nations, we had the Second World War, which was even worse and which ended with nuclear bombs. So in a way, we're in a more serious place now. And I think that's one of the reasons why people feel very frightened and very down. But one of the impacts on me of the experience in Northern Ireland and in some of the other places is that it's actually only when you are in an existential crisis that you move to a different way of thinking. You know what it's like theoretically. You know, you've got a theory, you do some experiments, you find it doesn't quite work out, so you add a caveat or a little tweak or a little explanation that adds something to that. And you keep on doing that until eventually it just falls to pieces. It doesn't work anymore. And that's the point where you've got to make a step to a completely new way of thinking about what could be called a paradigm shift. I think we're at that place. I don't think that the way that we run things up until now works anymore. So what might a change look like? Well, we need to understand some of the things that are happening and going on. For example, we need to understand how do people find purpose and meaning in their lives? Because there are many people who don't feel that they have that now. There's a psychiatrist who worked quite a lot here in Oxford. He was at All Souls College for quite a while, and he has gone off to live in the Isle of Skye now, but he still writes a lot and does a lot of blog posts and conferences. His name's Ian McGilchrist, and he's written some very interesting books. But one of the things that he says is, look, there are three really important things for human beings in terms of meaning. The first thing is that we need to be part of a community of people. You know, you may not quite yet be a community of people, but if you were here for a little bit longer, you would be. You'd begin to build relationships with each other, agree, fall out, find new ways, but you'd become a community of people. And actually, one of the great things that's happened at Harris Manchester College over the last 30 years is that it formed a community, a lovely community of people. But that's really important. The second thing that's really important is to understand that we are part of nature. I remember doing some work with indigenous people, First Nation people in North America, and this chief started to talk to me. He was very cross. He was very angry. I said, what are you so angry about? He says, these bloody environmentalists, they're driving me crazy. I says, well, tell me about that. He says, yes. He said, I saw one of them recently, and I started to give off about all these regulations they were putting in place. And he said to me, but we're protecting the environment. And he says, I told him, I'm part of the environment, and you're not protecting me. And actually, that was a very deep comment, because it was saying, we as human beings are not there looking after the environment. We are part of the environment. And when you see yourself in that way, it's quite a different business. And that's the second thing that McGilchrist said is important. And the third is that we need to find some way of engaging meaningfully with that which is beyond us. You know, it's one thing to sit here and look up at the night sky, but when you start thinking about what's in that sky, how far away it is, the complexity of all of that, you realize there isn't the slightest possibility that with our little brains we'll be able to understand all of it. We'll get our own bits that we'll understand, that we work with, and so on and so on. But there is a complexity to the universe. There's a size. There's an extraordinary universe or universes of which we are part. And to have some kind of way of thinking about that gives you a sense of meaning, and it may be religious or maybe intellectual or maybe some other kind of, but we need some sense of meaning if we're not just to live in chaos. And I mention those things because it seems to me that if we are in a place where I think many of us are, that we look around at what's happening, we see the real dangers, not just of war, but of a war to end all wars, of climate catastrophe, which is very real, but not being taken seriously enough by humanity as a whole. We've already experienced a pandemic or pandemics, and there will be more. Fortunately, some people in Oxford were prepared for the last one and helped a lot of humanity, but we got to be prepared for the next one and the next one. And technology has taken us to an extraordinary place. It's different from anything that was there before. Let me give you 2 or 3 examples before I finish. Every time there was a new technology before, it was possible for humanity to find a way of working with it and using it. But it didn't change humanity. One of my colleagues is going to, in the next week or 2, be publishing a book because she has been looking at children and young people and the impact of social media and the use of the internet on how their personalities develop. In other words, it's not a question of them having developed and matured and having a personality that relates to these new tools. It is that these new tools themselves change the formation of their personalities. And we don't quite know what the consequences of that are, but they are consequences we have not experienced before. If we look at war and weapons, we now have a situation where we can deliver at hypersonic speeds missiles with nuclear warheads. In other words, once they're gone, once they've been fired, it's too late to stop them. And in fact, it even goes further than that because, as you know, this country has a nuclear deterrent which involves a number of submarines going around the place, and the deterrent is supposed to be that don't fire at us, because if you do, we have a submarine somewhere that you don't know, and we will fire back with a nuclear weapon. Problem is, if their anti-ballistic missiles are operating at hypersonic speed, your nuclear target is not even going to get to the target. So there are extraordinary changes taking place. You may say frightening changes that are taking place, and they are. But humanity in the past has found a way of understanding itself better and engaging with these challenges. And that's what the responsibility is for this generation. And as doctors, you know, we've got an incredible privilege. We enter into more forms of intellectual life, scientific, literary, human, with more different kinds of people who are prepared to allow us into their communities and into their personal lives. We have tremendous privileges, but with privileges come responsibilities. It is for our generation, I have to say, your generation, and hopefully our children's generation, to help humanity find a way forward, as has been the case in the past. Is it possible? Yes, it is. Is it inevitable? No, it's not. Jürgen Moltmann, one of the most famous Protestant theologians of the 20th century, a German, he died a couple of months ago in his 90s, and he tells this story, which has been told by others before, about the two planets passing each other in space. And one calls out to the other, "How are you over there?" And the other one calls back, "Not very well." "Oh," said the first one, "I'm sorry to hear that. What's wrong?" "I've got a bad dose of Homo sapiens," says the other one. "Don't worry," the other one replied, "it won't last very long." And we have to take that seriously. There is no right to exist. There is no guarantee to exist. There is no guarantee that any human relationships we put in place will survive. But we have to work to make sure that they do. There are those who would like guarantees. We can't provide those. As doctors, we know that. When people come along, they want to know, how long will this take? Will I be cured? Will it come back? How did it happen? In most cases, we can't really give them an answer, but we can give them a relationship with us, a therapeutic relationship with us. And in all the work that we're doing with AI, which is really important and helps us to progress, there is not a replacement for human relationships. And you may say, as some colleagues do, "Well, yes, but this AI is helping some of my patients and they're able to manage better." I say, yes, but you know something? Curing their difficulty in relating to the computer is not the same thing as helping them to relate to other human beings. And that's the thing that we can bring as physicians. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, John. Absolutely fantastic, and what a career, really. So maybe, what I'll do is I'll kick off with a couple of questions, and then we'll open this up to those in the room and colleagues online as well. So John, you've worked very closely with politicians from all parties, various kind of political leanings. And I guess one of the things that struck me in your presentation was you mentioned the fact that politicians aren't particularly rational beings. They've got anxieties. And I wonder if you could just kind of expand on a bit on what are the commonest anxieties that you've come across in political leaders? Because in part, I think if we are going to be able to engage, it's important to understand some of those dynamics, I think, meaningfully. And is this mic working? Yeah. Yeah. Why don't you take this mic, please? Yeah.
That's great. Thanks very much. Well, of course, like the rest of humanity, there's quite a variety of anxieties, some of which are based very much on their own personal background. But there is an enormous anxiety for people in public life, and particularly politicians, that they will be set aside, defeated, humiliated, treated with disrespect, treated unfairly, and often people are accused of all sorts of things that they're not necessarily guilty of, and this is becoming worse with fake news and the internet and so on. Public life is actually becoming a very, very unwelcoming place, and it's becoming more and more difficult to persuade people to go into public life because of that. But sometimes it's possible to tune into some of the anxieties in a way that can be constructive. So I give you an example. Obviously, one of the points at which people were getting very anxious in the Northern Ireland context was the first time that traditional enemies met with each other. So we got to a point where the various political parties were meeting together with the Dublin government, the Irish government, and the British government. And there was a bit of an argument about the order in which we would speak, because nobody wanted to go first, because that's always a dangerous place. So eventually there was an agreement that we would go in alphabetical order, which meant I always went first, because Alliance started with an A. And that, of course, gave me an opportunity then to set a tone. So when we came to the first meeting, I thought of exactly your question. So what are they going to be anxious about? Well, the press were all saying, these are a crowd of charlatans. They've no intention of reaching an agreement. They're not going to reach an agreement. It's all just a silly game, and we're all paying for it, and they're not providing any real hope for any of us at all. So I started off, given the first opportunity to speak, I said, you know, we all have a big problem. So in other words, we're together on this, whatever the other do. We've all got a big problem. The problem is, as you and I came in here this morning, the press were standing outside, and they were saying the same thing about all of us. That we're not trustworthy, we're dishonest, we're only kidding the people, we're not going to reach an agreement, we don't intend to reach an agreement. This is a really big problem for us. And there is a real genuine problem, because let's say we do reach an agreement with each other, we will have reached an agreement with our traditional enemies. And some people will say, you've betrayed all of those who died on our side in the fight. But the other side of it is, if we don't reach an agreement with each other, we may not be betraying the past, but we will be betraying our children and our grandchildren. And for me, in the end, that's the betrayal I must avoid most. And by speaking out the anxieties, setting them out and saying, look, we share these anxieties, we all have these anxieties, it began to become possible for some of them to engage with each other. And when it came to coffee time, people would go and they would start to talk with each other. So there are lots of different anxieties that individuals have, but in certain contexts there are common anxieties. And it's not a question of manipulating those. If you try to manipulate people, it never works positively. But if you can honestly recognize them and speak about them, put them into words, it can then begin to become possible to deal with them in a constructive way.
Yeah, really helpful. So, I mean, John, my own experience, and many of us will have experience of working with governments, with ministers. So, I mean, I think my own take on this is that there are difficult conversations to be had, and quite often there are. Those are done behind closed doors. They're never played out in the media, because in the media you may win sort of an individual battle, but what you then do is you've kind of undermined that relationship, because what you don't want to do is really underline, go out to humiliate people, as you were saying. So, I mean, I think there are some really important lessons for us there. But John, I want to then just kind of move forward, and you mentioned really in this hierarchy of needs, I mean, the greatest need that we have is to be respected, not to be humiliated. But if we look, I mean, not in the House of Lords, but in the House of Commons with our adversarial kind of political structures, parliamentary question time, for example, in the UK, I think is the archetypal example where this is all about point scoring and humiliation. So how could we sort of rethink and restructure our political processes in a way that, I mean, I think would also inspire the public with a lot more confidence as well?
I think it's important for colleagues to find ways of disagreeing with each other that aren't humiliating the other person. And it's often very tempting to humiliate. I remember watching Obama, who I was very fond of. I thought he was a great guy in many ways. But I remember watching him do the White House Press Corps annual dinner. And he was very funny. I mean, and that's one of those annual dinners where that's what you're supposed to do, be amusing and so on. And he was. But the main butt of his humor was Donald Trump. And Trump was there. And the camera panned round to him. And I looked at it and I thought, that's a disaster. That man is going to spend the rest of his life trying to take to pieces everything that you have done. And I said this recently to a journalistic colleague, and he said, you're absolutely right. I was there. I saw it happening. And I knew what the consequences of this would be. And yet it was very tempting. It was funny. It was amusing and so on. I think we have to try to find ways of disagreeing with each other without humiliating each other. People often say to me, oh, it was great you got an agreement in Northern Ireland. Yes, but do you understand? It was an agreement to disagree without killing each other. Unionists and nationalists don't agree about the past. They don't agree about the future. They just agree that it's better for us to disagree without killing each other for the sake of our children. And I think that's the transformation that's necessary. So it's perfectly reasonable to disagree. In fact, it's important to disagree. But it's how you disagree. Now, the House of Lords has found particular ways of doing this. You know, so people in the House of Lords are there for the whole of their lifetime, and indeed in the past they were there for, you know, their families were there for hundreds of years. And so we found a way of speaking about things at the House of Lords that obviates that sort of thing. So, for example, if I want to say to a member of the House of Lords, I disagree completely with you, I think it's utter nonsense what you're talking about. I don't say that. I say, well, my lords, it's always a pleasure to listen to the noble lord. He is an adornment to your lordship's house. But if on this one thing I might have a slightly different gloss, it would be to say such and such. And people sometimes think, well, that's a crazy way of speaking. But actually, what it means is that you have saved that person's respect. And you're going to be there for the rest of your life, and they're going to be there for the rest of theirs. It's different in the Commons. Come the next election, half of them aren't there, and possibly you aren't either. So when I went back to Northern Ireland, and I'd been in the Lords for a short time, and did the same kinds of things with people like Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness and so on, you suddenly found it became possible to engage, and often with a little bit of humour, in a way that made it possible for people to disagree with each other. So there are ways to disagree. And your point about how to do that without disrespect is a really important point.
Yeah, no, fantastically important lesson there. I mean, we all have this kind of inherent nobility, and I think respecting that is just so important. I want to kind of wind this up, take it in a different direction. And so, John, you mentioned about sort of unfairness, and I want to kind of link this to democracy. And democracy, I mean, I think has been, a fantastic achievement in so many senses. But one of the things that always strikes me is that when we look at the United Nations and we look at the permanent members of the Security Council, these are all the kind of artifacts of war, really, aren't they? The spoils of war. So why haven't we been able to democratize that institution? Because I think so many of the kind of concerns that people have about unfairness stem from the fact that really this is a kind of a reflection of the spoils of war.
Well, you're right, there is a really serious problem, and there have been many efforts to try to resolve it by restructuring the Security Council. But it's never been possible to do it because, of course, those who were in the position of having vetoes always veto it if they're going to lose their power or influence. The consequence of this is that the United Nations itself is becoming not just dysfunctional, but powerless. And it is important to remember the United Nations is really just a table that the various countries can come to engage with each other. I don't actually think that there is any structure that can be achieved that will resolve the problem that you're describing of itself. I think unless we find a different way for countries to relate with each other in the way that I've alluded to, then no amount of tinkering around with it is actually going to bring the outcome we want. And the United Nations could go the same way as the League of Nations, just gradually become completely irrelevant. And you sort of see that happening already at the moment because, you know, Russia's not paying any attention to it. China is managing very, very cleverly, thank you very much. America's a total disaster. It's tearing it to pieces. And Britain and France are left, neither of them with the kind of power that they had at the time that that was happening. Now, having said that, and it's all kind of depressing kind of thing, there are two people who have made interventions recently, which I think raise different kinds of hope. One is actually Pope Leo. And it's a pretty extraordinary thing for a Protestant from Northern Ireland to be saying that the Pope is doing such a wonderful job. But he has found a way of speaking truth to power in a very substantial way. And the very fact that he is not politically powerful, but is able to bring a moral authority is a really important thing. The second person is Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, that extraordinary speech at Davos. And not just at Davos, but then subsequently to that, other speeches, where he has said, look, we recognize we're middle powers, we're not big powers. And we're going to have to work together if we're going to be, as he said, not just at the table. We don't want to be on the menu, he said. We want to be at the table. And so he said, we need to find ways of working together, which will not necessarily be structures a la the League of Nations or the United Nations. It may be a different way of working together. And if you say exactly what, he said, no, there isn't an exactly what just yet. We're working on it. We're trying to understand it. We're trying to develop the principles of respect and engagement and non-violence and not threatening and so on. And I think that, I have to tell you, gave me a sense of hope that there are people there in positions of leadership with moral and in some cases political authority who can help to take us forward. We do not have the solution of the next step at this point. And there will not be a solution in the way that we might have liked to believe before. You know, when somebody says to you that they've got a relationship sorted out, it's already in trouble because they think it's sorted. Relationships are organic things that you have to continually work with and work at. And that's true politically as much as personally. And I think when we recognize that, and I think there are some recognitions of that in the things that those two individuals are saying, we move beyond the increasingly illegitimate, one might even say irrelevant structures of the United Nations and of international relations.
Okay, thanks. Fantastic.